The Peninsular War. In 1808, Napoleon, at the height of his power, marched into Spain to secure the Iberian Peninsula and block Britain. At first, his armies looked unstoppable, over 300,000 French soldiers sweeping across the land. But Spain turned out to be his nightmare. The spark came when Napoleon forced the abdication of Spain's king and placed his brother Joseph on the throne. Ordinary Spaniards erupted in fury. Peasants, priests, and villagers refused to fight in neat battle lines. Instead, they hit French patrols, sabotaged supply lines, and vanished into mountains. This was Guerra de Guerillas, Little War, the first time the word guerrilla entered military history. Casualties were staggering. Tens of thousands of French troops, more than 200,000 over the war, were drained not by grand battles, but by endless ambushes, raids, and assassinations. On top of that, Britain, under the Duke of Wellington, landed 40,000 troops to back the insurgents. Suddenly, Napoleon was fighting both a guerrilla shadow army and British regulars. Major turning points came at battles like Bayen in 1808, the first time one of Napoleon's field armies collapsed in open battle, and Salamanca in 1812, which shattered French control in Spain. By 1814, Napoleon pulled his battered armies back across the Pyrenees. The Peninsular War didn't just bleed France of manpower, it taught the world something new. A population armed with willpower can make an empire crumble. It cost France nearly 300,000 men, inspired future guerrilla movements from Latin America to Vietnam, and gave Britain the foothold that ultimately pushed Napoleon toward his downfall at Waterloo.
The Boer Wars. There were two brutal clashes in South Africa between Britain, the world's biggest empire, and small, stubborn Boer republics made up of Dutch-descended farmers. The First Boer War broke out in 1880. Less than 10,000 Boers rose up when Britain tried to annex the Transvaal. They used mobility, intimate knowledge of the land, and sharpshooting from horseback. At battles like Majuba Hill in 1881, they humiliated British troops accustomed to open-field fighting. Shockingly, Britain backed down, handing the Boers a short-lived independence. But everything changed with the Second Boer War starting in 1899. This time, the stakes were far higher. South Africa's gold and diamond riches, some of the most valuable in the world. Nearly 500,000 British troops poured in against only about 50,000 Boer fighters. Once again, Boers waged hit-and-run ambushes, destroyed railways, and melted back into the veldt. The British, frustrated, responded with a scorched earth policy, burning farms, seizing civilians, and herding women and children into concentration camps. Poor conditions there killed over 25,000 Boer civilians, most of them children. By 1902, sheer numbers forced the exhausted Boers to surrender. Their republics were absorbed into the British Empire. But victory came at a staggering cost: over 20,000 British dead, tens of thousands of Boer fighters gone, and international outrage at Britain's tactics. The Boer Wars changed military history. They proved that guerrilla warfare could humble even a global superpower. And they introduced words like commando and concentration camp into modern warfare. And in the long run, they set the stage for apartheid-era South Africa, shaping politics there for the next century.
The Philippine-American War. At the end of the Spanish-American War in 1898, the United States promised to liberate the Philippines from Spain. But instead of independence, Washington bought the islands for $20 million in the Treaty of Paris. For Filipinos who'd already declared their own republic under Emilio Aguinaldo, this was betrayal. War erupted in 1899 with around 80,000 Filipino troops fighting U.S. forces. At first, they fought conventionally, lining up for pitched battles, but American firepower crushed them. Aguinaldo then shifted to guerrilla tactics, ambushes, sabotage, and blending into the civilian population. The U.S. responded with overwhelming force. Over 126,000 American soldiers were deployed, making this one of America's first large overseas wars. Villages were torched, civilians relocated into reconcentration zones, and food supplies destroyed to cut off guerrilla support. Brutal reprisals, including massacres like at Balangiga, scarred the occupation. By 1902, Aguinaldo had been captured and major resistance collapsed, but the cost was staggering. About 4,200 American deaths, yet far more devastating for the Philippines. Estimates range from 200,000 to 300,000 Filipino civilian deaths, mostly from famine, disease, and displacement. In the short term, the U.S. cemented its control, making the Philippines its first true colony and strategic base in Asia. In the long term, though, the war ignited a strong Filipino nationalism that never went away. Independence wouldn't come until 1946, but the memory of guerrilla resistance shaped the nation's identity and exposed the darker side of America's rise as a global power.
The Irish War of Independence. After centuries of British rule, Ireland exploded in 1919. The political movement Sinn Féin declared independence, and its armed wing, the Irish Republican Army, led by Michael Collins, launched a guerrilla war that Britain never saw coming. Instead of large battles, Collins relied on flying columns, small mobile squads striking police barracks, ambushing convoys, and assassinating intelligence agents. Dublin even became a city of shadows, where British spies were hunted down one by one. Britain deployed nearly 100,000 troops, including the feared Black and Tans. They tried to smash the rebellion with raids, reprisals, and burning villages, but every harsh act only drove more Irish civilians into supporting the IRA. By 1921, neither side could truly win. Over 2,000 fighters and civilians were dead, and Ireland was exhausted. A truce was signed, leading to the Anglo-Irish Treaty, which split the island. The Irish Free State became independent, while 6 counties, Northern Ireland, remained part of Britain. The war proved that small, determined forces could force the world's greatest empire to the negotiating table. But it also planted the seeds for future conflict between nationalists and unionists, a shadow still felt in Northern Ireland today.
The Greek Civil War. At the end of World War II, Greece fell into one of the Cold War's first battlegrounds. On one side, communist partisans, veterans of the resistance against Nazi occupation. On the other, nationalist royalist forces backed by Britain and later the United States. The Communist Democratic Army controlled rugged mountains and villages, using ambushes and guerrilla tactics. They had early momentum, drawing support from Yugoslavia and from resentment at the return of the old monarchy. Britain, financially broke, handed leadership of the war to the U.S. The Truman Doctrine of 1947 poured in arms, money, and advisors. By 1949, government forces numbered over 250,000 men carrying modern American equipment. Massive bombing campaigns, scorched earth tactics, and the sealing of Greece's northern borders with Albania and Yugoslavia cut off the rebels. The result was devastating. Around 158,000 people were killed, villages were destroyed, and nearly 1 million were displaced. The communists collapsed by late 1949, forcing thousands into exile. The war's legacy was huge. It locked Greece firmly into the Western Bloc during the Cold War, showcased U.S. willingness to intervene abroad, and left Greece haunted by political divisions and authoritarian rule for decades. It was, in effect, the Cold War's opening act.
The Algerian War of Independence. For over a century, Algeria was France's prized colony. By the 1950s, nearly 1 million European settlers dominated a population of 9 million Algerians, fueling resentment, poverty, and national humiliation. In 1954, the National Liberation Front, FLN, launched armed revolt. Guerrilla fighters struck military posts, police stations, and communication lines, forcing the world to pay attention. France struck back with overwhelming force, deploying over 500,000 troops, using torture, mass arrests, and even recruitment camps, where over 2 million villagers were relocated. The war's most infamous phase came in Algiers, where FLN cells carried out bombings and assassinations in cafes and public spaces, a campaign called the Battle of Algiers. French paratroopers eventually crushed the city insurgency, but at the cost of international outrage and revelations of systematic torture. Brutal deadlock followed, tens of thousands killed, villages destroyed, and both sides guilty of atrocities. By the late 1950s, global opinion shifted, and France itself broke apart politically, culminating in Charles de Gaulle realizing that Algeria's independence was inevitable. In 1962, after 8 years of war and nearly 500,000 deaths, Algeria became independent. But the fight left deep scars. A divided society, waves of refugees, and a legacy of urban terrorism and counterinsurgency that shaped wars from Latin America to the Middle East.
The Vietnam War. Few wars defined guerrilla struggle like Vietnam. After defeating France at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, Vietnam was split, the Communist North under Ho Chi Minh and the US-backed South. The Viet Cong, communist insurgents in the South, waged what Mao called a people's war. They dug 75 miles of tunnels, booby-trapped trails, and struck with hit-and-run sniper fire, blending in with villagers by day and fighters by night. At their peak, they numbered more than 300,000 fighters. The United States poured in over 2.7 million soldiers between 1965 and 1973, unleashing bombing campaigns like Operation Rolling Thunder, dropping more than 7 million tons of bombs, more than all of World War II combined. Entire regions were defoliated with Agent Orange. Despite this, the Viet Cong's resilience, combined with large-scale offensives like the Tet Offensive of 1968, convinced many Americans the war could not be won. By 1973, the U.S. withdrew, and by April 1975, Saigon fell to the North Vietnamese Army. Casualties were catastrophic, about 58,000 American dead compared to millions of Vietnamese soldiers and civilians. Vietnam redefined modern war. It showed that even the strongest superpower could be dragged down by a poorly equipped force with patience, local support, and willpower.
The Cuban Revolution. In the 1950s, Cuba was ruled by dictator Fulgencio Batista, backed by U.S. business interests, casinos, and a repressive police state. In 1953, a young lawyer named Fidel Castro launched an attack on the Moncada barracks. It failed, but it sparked a movement. After prison and exile in Mexico, Castro returned in 1956 with just 82 fighters, including Che Guevara. Only about a dozen survived to take refuge in the Sierra Maestra Mountains. From there, they waged classic guerrilla warfare, small ambushes, hit-and-run raids, propaganda to win peasants' trust. As Batista's regime grew more brutal, rural Cubans increasingly saw the rebels as heroes. By 1958, Castro's guerrilla forces had swelled to thousands, launching offensives that broke Batista's collapsing army. On January 1, 1959, Batista fled. Overnight, Cuba flipped. The rebels rode into Havana, capturing the world's attention. The revolution's long-term impact was enormous. Castro aligned with the Soviet Union, sparking decades of U.S.-Cuba hostility, from the Bay of Pigs invasion to the Cuban Missile Crisis. But militarily, it became textbook proof that a tiny mountain army, with discipline and narrative on its side, could overthrow a U.S.-backed state.
The Mau Mau Uprising. Kenya in the 1950s was still under British colonial control, with vast farmland reserved for European settlers. African communities, especially the Kikuyu, simmered under land seizures, forced labor, and political exclusion. In 1952, the Mau Mau movement erupted. Fighters, often armed with little more than rifles, knives, or homemade weapons, struck at loyalist chiefs, British farms, and police outposts. They relied on forests like the Aberdares and Mount Kenya as cover, and tight secret oaths to enforce loyalty. The British responded with overwhelming force. Over 50,000 soldiers and police, plus settler militias. They created emergency villages, essentially internment camps, and carried out mass crackdowns. By the end, as many as 1.5 million Kikuyu civilians were confined under harsh conditions. The war killed at least 12,000 Mau Mau and civilians, compared to about 100 European settlers and a few thousand African loyalists. While militarily crushed by 1960, the uprising shook Britain's image of control and accelerated Kenya's path to independence in 1963. Its legacy is still debated as terrorism, resistance, or both, but it showed how even a small, poorly armed insurgency could force an empire to retreat.
The Soviet-Afghan War. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan to rescue a faltering communist government. What they walked into was a decade-long nightmare. The Afghan mujahideen, rooted in local tribes and Islamist networks, waged classic guerrilla warfare. Ambushes in mountain passes, sabotage of supply lines, and constant sniping from high ground. Soviet forces, nearly 100,000 strong at peak, held cities but could never pacify the countryside. The US, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan poured billions in weapons and aid. Washington funneled in advanced arms like the Stinger missile, which made Soviet helicopters, once their greatest advantage, easy targets. By the mid-1980s, Mujahideen killed Soviet troops at a rate of hundreds per month. In total, the war claimed over 15,000 Soviet lives and wounded tens of thousands more. By 1989, the Soviets withdrew, humiliated. For Moscow, it became their Vietnam, a costly foreign quagmire that drained morale and sped the USSR's collapse 2 years later. For Afghanistan, the legacy was equally devastating. Nearly 1 million Afghan dead, millions displaced, and armed Islamist networks that would later evolve into groups like the Taliban and Al-Qaeda.
The Chinese Communist Revolution. China in the early 20th century was fractured. Warlords, a weak republic, Japanese invasion, and deep poverty. In this chaos, Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Party developed the most influential guerrilla strategy ever, the protracted People's War. From 1927, Mao's forces battled the nationalist Kuomintang, or KMT. Driven into rural bases, the communists survived by blending with peasants, waging ambushes, sabotage, and political education. When nationalists nearly crushed them in the 1930s, Mao led the Long March, 6,000 miles across China, with only about 10% of 80,000 fighters surviving, but it cemented Mao's myth. During World War II, the communists expanded dramatically while fighting Japanese occupiers. By 1945, their guerrilla networks had millions of supporters. When Japan fell, full civil war resumed. Mao's army, once ragtag, now numbered over 1 million. By exploiting rural support, discipline, and nationalist corruption, they swept south. In 1949, Mao declared the People's Republic of China. It was both a national revolution and a global turning point. Mao's playbook, base building, political indoctrination, surround the cities from the countryside, became the model for insurgencies from Vietnam to Latin America. It proved guerrilla warfare could not just harass an enemy, but conquer a vast nation.
The Rhodesian Bush War. In southern Africa, Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, was ruled by a minority white settler government led by Ian Smith, determined to block majority rule. Beginning in the mid-1960s, two main nationalist groups, the ZANU, backed largely by China, and ZAPU, supported by the Soviet Union, launched guerrilla campaigns from bases in Mozambique and Zambia. Guerrillas infiltrated rural areas, ambushing patrols, mining roads, and assassinating collaborators. At their peak, over 20,000 insurgents operated in the countryside, fighting a Rhodesian security force of about 40,000 troops supported by air power and South African assistance. Rhodesia developed elite units like the Selous Scouts, experts in pseudo-operations and tracking, and waged cross-border raids with devastating effect. But over time, the sheer scale of the insurgency wore them down. Civilian atrocities, forced relocations, and sanctions eroded Rhodesia's legitimacy abroad. By 1979, the war had killed over 20,000 people. Facing isolation and an unstoppable tide, Smith's government entered negotiations. In 1980, Rhodesia transitioned into Zimbabwe under Robert Mugabe. The Bush War was a classic case where guerrilla persistence overcame a well-armed minority state, and it marked the collapse of white rule regimes across much of Africa.
The Sri Lankan Civil War. For decades, Sri Lanka was torn apart by one of the longest insurgencies of the modern era. The minority Tamil Tigers, LTTE, took up arms in the early 1980s, demanding an independent Tamil homeland after years of ethnic discrimination and riots against Tamils.
The LTTE became infamous innovations in guerrilla warfare, a navy of sea tigers, women fighters in the front lines, and the world's first organized use of suicide bombings, including the assassinations of Indian Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi in 1991 and Sri Lankan President Ranasinghe Premadasa in 1993. At their height, they controlled nearly a third of the island, fielding nearly 20,000 fighters. The Sri Lankan government fought back with brutal campaigns, aided by Indian peacekeepers in the late 1980s, then later with massive offensives funded by Chinese and Pakistani arms. Civilian massacres, forced recruitment by the Tigers, and relentless shelling by the army turned the war into one of Asia's bloodiest conflicts. By 2009, after 26 years and over 80,000 to 100,000 dead, government forces annihilated the LTTE in a final offensive. Images of civilians trapped in fire zones shocked the world, but the state declared victory. The Sri Lankan Civil War showed both the terrifying effectiveness and eventual limits of guerrilla insurgencies, and it reshaped debates on human rights, counterterrorism, and ethnic reconciliation for decades. The Colombian conflict. Colombia's insurgency began in the 1960s when left-wing Ural rebels formed the FARC, Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. Their aim, Marxist revolution against inequality, backed at first by peasant support. Small mobile bands carried out ambushes, kidnappings, and attacks on state forces. By the 1980s and 90s, FARC grew to nearly 20,000 fighters. They funded themselves with ransoms, extortion, and later by taxing and trafficking coca, the backbone of the drug trade. Guerrilla units controlled vast jungle zones, building parallel governments. The state responded with special counterinsurgency battalions, backed by billions of U.S. aid in Plan Colombia. Brutal right-wing paramilitaries also joined in, targeting guerrilla sympathizers, often massacring civilians. By the 2000s, FARC was battered by precision raids, desertions, and the rescue of high-profile hostages like Ingrid Betancourt in 2008. Still, the conflict dragged on for over 5 decades, costing 260,000 lives, displacing over 7 million, one of the worst humanitarian crises in the Americas. In 2016, FARC signed a peace deal with the government, laying down arms. It was one of the longest wars in the Western Hemisphere, proving how guerrilla movements can survive for generations by adapting to geography, illicit funding, and fractured politics. The Taliban insurgency. In late 2001, after 9/11, the U.S. invaded Afghanistan and quickly toppled the Taliban regime. But instead of ending, the war morphed into one of the longest insurgencies in modern history. The Taliban regrouped in rural provinces and across the Pakistani border. Blending tribal loyalties, religious ideology, and guerrilla tactics, they struck with motorcycle ambushes, assassinations, IED roadside bombs, and suicide attacks. Despite U.S. technological superiority, Taliban units could disappear into villages or mountains just as Soviet forces once struggled. At their peak, international forces numbered over 130,000 troops, backed by billions of dollars. Yet the Taliban spread influence steadily, exploiting government corruption and civilian casualties caused by foreign airstrikes. Strongholds in Helmand and Kandahar became unbreakable. Although U.S. raids killed leaders, including Mullah Omar's successors, the insurgency endured. In 2020, the U.S. signed a deal with the Taliban, and by August 2021, U.S. forces withdrew. Within days, the Taliban swept into Kabul, toppling the Western-backed government without a fight. The war claimed over 170,000 lives, including 46,000 civilians. For America, it was its longest war. For the world, it was proof that patient guerrilla movements, if rooted in local identity and safe havens, can outlast even a superpower.